Amazon's The Boys is absolutely god-awful. Kind of. I'm gonna explain. Alright, when I say The Boys is terrible, I don't necessarily mean the show itself sucks. I actually enjoy it quite a bit myself despite my grievances with it. That said, I mentioned I'm a big fan of the comics, and the show does such a terrible job at adapting the source material that it isn't even recognizable as the thing that I love anymore. The fact that this show isn't accurate to the source material in the slightest is a huge letdown for me personally, considering the exact same thing happened a couple years ago when AMC unsuccessfully adapted my favorite comic of all time, Preacher, which is also written by Garth Ennis. Preacher started out with a fairly accurate first season, following most of the important story beats from the comic, but after a season it quickly went off the rails and it was clear they decided they no longer wanted to make a Preacher show, and instead they turned it into some wacky, gross-out comedy. While it was fairly entertaining, due in part to stellar performances by Pip Torrens as Hare Starr.
What the hell are you doing?
What does it look like? I'm self-consummating.
And the All-American Reject singer as Humperdew or Jesus. The show all but disregarded most of the important plot points and themes touched on in the comic, and it just fell flat and wasn't a good adaptation. And not only were The Boys and Preacher written by Garth Ennis, the other commonality here was their television adaptations were produced by Seth Rogen. It honestly feels like he can't help himself from just destroying all my favorite comic properties. Now, there are countless ways in which The Boys makes changes from the source material, be it to separate itself in some way from the comic to simply be different, or in a few cases to make improvements upon the story to lend itself better to television, which as a phrase in general I find to just be an easy out for someone who doesn't want to or isn't talented enough to tell the story the way it is. I think this point is proven when you have a show like Invincible, which is amazing and almost allowed beat for beat to follow its comic counterpart. This is obviously a bit easier due to it being an animated series, but the point remains. Now, I'm not saying all adaptations have to be a one-to-one recreation. There are some changes that The Boys makes that does lend itself better to a modern audience. I mean, a lot has changed in the last 15 years since the comic came out. For an example of some of the positive changes they've made, fleshing out and changing up Starlight's backstory and introduction, giving the Deep and A-Train an actual character arc, as well as updating a lot of the social commentary to be more reflective of modern issues like feminism and the power of social media influence. Now, my goal here isn't just to rattle off all the ways in which the show is different from the comic. You can go read a MovieWeb article for that. What I want to do is outline a few of the changes that make the biggest impact in creating a mediocre adaptation of the comic. Now, just a heads up, there will be a few spoilers for the comic. I will try to keep them somewhat vague because I genuinely do want people to go give the comic a read. I understand that most people who've seen the show probably haven't seen the comic, and a lot of that's probably due to all these videos out there bashing the comic as juvenile or one-dimensional, but I really want people to give it a chance, and that's kind of what this video is about. So with no further ado, let's get into the changes the TV show made from the comic that annoy me the most. Okay, honestly, this one I can see both sides of the argument for. In the comics, each of the boys was injected with this military-created version of Compound V that provided them superhuman strength and durability. This made them stronger than all of the lower-tier supes, however, any of the 7 or higher-tier superheroes, they could still tear them apart. Now, I understand the show decided to give them powers later on, but keep in mind, the boys were the boys long before Huey joined the scene. So them not having powers for the first 2 seasons and prior impacts how their team is viewed by the world around them. Personally, one of my favorite parts of the Boys comic was how terrified the superheroes were of the Boys. But the big story issue I have here is this leads to a huge level of suspension of disbelief on my part when watching the show. And yes, I understand we're watching a superhero show, but there are about 50 times the boys should have been outright dead on the TV show, regardless of what cell phone recording they're holding as leverage over someone. The boys are peons compared to Homelander. He could end them at any moment despite their threats of exposing him, but he never does. I understand the goal is to make the boys more strategic with their plans to take out Supes, but honestly that isn't the boys. They were a serious physical threat, and it led to a bunch of great moments and fights. For example, one of my favorite moments came when Huey just been unknowingly injected against his will with Compound V by Butcher, and him not yet knowing how to control his strength accidentally punched a hole in a low-level soup, killing him. The entire power dynamic just feels off, and I get the writers wanted to make it more of a David versus Goliath story, but when they give them powers in the end anyways, I don't understand the reasoning for this change other than just to make it further from the comic and leave me wondering where the boys got their plot armor and where I can go buy some. Honestly, there's a ton they did right about the TV show Black Noir. They built him up as the best character in the show, and I was excited to see what they were going to do with him. I liked his wacky and silly antics and goofy side stories they gave him. The issues began when they decided to give him a backstory. So spoiler alert. In the comic, there's a huge twist at the end, and it turns out Black Noir is basically a clone of Homelander made for the sole purpose of taking out Homelander in the instance he goes too far or loses control. Another part of the twist is many of the horrific things we see Homelander do that he can't seem to remember, which is driving him insane, are actually done by the truly insane Black Noir. Now, I understand the showrunners wanted to have their own endgame outside of the comic ending, and even though realistically most of the viewers of the show haven't read the comic and never will, but Black Noir being shrouded in mystery is part of what makes his character great in the comic, and honestly in the show as well. It really feels like giving him such a mediocre backstory, basically turning him into a mall ninja, and then killing him off in pathetic fashion, was just a middle finger subversion to the fans of the comic. I genuinely think it would have been better if they used the same twist, but maybe not as an endgame, and instead use it as a twist or a new challenge for Homelander to face. The comic wasn't perfect, but story beats felt intentional, like everything was building up to something. The show so far has felt very random, like they're making things up on the spot, and it ends up making me feel like I'm watching a CW show that got the green light to say fuck and show pee-pee holes. This one's a pretty big one, and it honestly changes a lot of the team dynamics for the worst. Huey in the comic is the team's moral center, especially for Butcher, who has very little if any conscience, regularly committing genocide en masse. So having someone around like Huey who's idealistic and pure of heart is essentially allowing him to reconsider his actions at times. Butcher realizes this himself, and he does all he can to keep Huey close, seeing him as a brother. Huey to Butcher is pretty obviously a surrogate for his brother Lenny, who he lost when he was young, as shown in the issue Butcher Baker Candlestick Maker, and Butcher, in one of his more sincere moments in the comic, expresses to Huey these feelings. Sort of. However, in the television version, Huey is just as morally flawed as the rest, if not kind of an asshole, leading to a much more nihilistic perspective on the story. Butcher and Huey are also already on bad terms by the end of season 1, making their friendship a much less important element to the story. Honestly, in the show it seems like none of the boys even like each other and are only still around due to plot necessity. Apart from the female and Frenchie at least, which I almost like, but it almost feels kinda creepy how infatuated Frenchie is with Kamiko for very little reason. Huey is the heart of the team in the comic, and his dysfunctional relationship with Butcher are kind of core to what make the story work for me. Okay, so this is definitely going to be my biggest gripe of the video, so buckle up. And before I start, I just want to note that Karl Urban is an amazing TV Butcher, and had the writers done the comic justice, he would have smashed the comic version too. However, I really think the writers of this show misunderstood the comic. Butcher was never the main character. He may have been the face of the series in that he's a cool guy with funny dog sidekick, but Huey's always been the focal point of the comic. He's the everyman. He's the character we're meant to relate to. The show decided, fuck Huey, Butcher's cooler, and he really became the center of the show, which I think pigeonholed them into a lot of my previous complaints, because you can't really have an emotionless sociopath as a main character of a TV show. So they scaled Butcher's assholery down and Huey's up, which kind of ruins the codependent relationship element that's really vital to the entire plot of the comic. By giving Butcher more depth, they stripped down the core relationship of the boys' team down to a group of people that don't actually like each other. I understand that funny British psychopath with zero empathy isn't an ideal character for a TV show that wants to bring to life a more human story, but his personality made the story work. The writers seemingly went for an if we can't fix it, break it approach, instead of coming up with something more clever. In the comic, Butcher has zero sympathy for Soups of any kind, but he's also a very caring friend. Yes, he's a fucking asshole who will inject you with super serum without asking, or pay a homeless man to splooge blood under your door every night, but he paid that homeless man to splooge blood under your door for a good reason. He wants you to move out of your ghetto-ass apartment. Overall, he cares about his friends. None of the boys are scared of him, they rely on each other, and they trust each other. In the show, he's just turned into this one-dimensional asshole blinded by rage, and his team is scared of him and they don't trust him, which hurts the dynamic of the team in my opinion. Because in the comic, the boys are a family. Very dysfunctional, but they're a family nonetheless. The fact that the boys trust this man with their life makes the ending all that much more powerful when, spoiler alert again, Butcher turns out to be the bad guy, killing both the female and Mother's Milk to complete his genocidal plan, leaving Huey as the only hope to stop him. There are obviously more things that bother me, but those are the main things that made it feel like it wasn't the boys to me. And I'll also say, if you enjoy the show more than the comic, that's perfectly fine and you're not wrong. But what you enjoy is an Amazon series that uses character likenesses from the comic The Boys. You don't actually like The Boys. The two things are so different at this point, it's so hard to compare them. And I won't pretend The Boys comic is some deep deconstruction of the superhero genre like The Watchmen for example, but what it does is poke fun at a very tame and generic genre at the time that almost parodies it while managing to create interesting characters that I cared about until they met their tragic ends. I understand the show had to take some liberties, and I applaud them for a lot of the changes they made. Despite a lot of my complaints, I still watch the show because Homelander just fucking steals the show every time. And something I wanted to bring up because it's the reason I made this video, I went back and watched The Boys Diabolical recently, which is an animated anthology series in the Boys universe, and honestly, it was meh. But there was this one episode that really got me excited. Episode 3, I'm Your Pusher. This episode was a fully comic accurate and animated episode of The Boys. The episode was everything I was hoping for from The Boys TV show, and I highly recommend checking it out if you want to understand a bit more what I mean when I say The Boys TV show is nothing like The Boys comic. I really pray one day we get a comic accurate retelling similar to this episode or Invincible, but until then, bye bye.